So first and foremost, I just want to say it's a real pleasure. It's not every day as an artist and a DJ you get to hear about cognitive theory and balloons popping. I was like, that's very Warholian. Um, so what I'm going to do today is present a couple quick pieces because I got 5 minutes. So what I'm going to do is walk you guys through some of the current projects that I'm doing relating to digital media and contemporary art. So are we ready? Oh, what? Okay. Wow. Okay. All right. While he's doing that, I'll just. All right, so they're switching out some cables. So when I was asked to speak here, basically one of the things that went through my mind was the role of the composer in contemporary 21st century culture. And I'm an artist. I went to Bowdoin College up in Maine. It's a little Ivy. Some people have, Bowdoin, Bates, Wesleyan, Haverford. The big schools were like Yale and Harvard and so on. But in New England, a funny thing happened. It was the ancient early 90s. And there was one place on campus to check the internet. It was called Telnet. I don't know if anybody remembers that. But I used to go there, and it would be the one place on campus where you could check internet. And there was a skinny guy who would hang out occasionally. And I found out later that was Reed Hastings. So he was a math major. I was majoring in macroeconomic policy. But I was having more fun DJing. So while we are waiting for this to happen, I'll just give you a little bit of a backdrop. When you think about the 21st century, the role of music and the arts is kind of incredible. On one hand, you have to imagine that Apple has now become the world's biggest record label because of its relationship to iTunes. But you also have to imagine that anyone who wants to have music discovery is going to be using YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, most of the streaming services. So the tension between streaming versus downloading has radically changed the way we think about consumption of culture. I've been publishing with MIT for a while. Mainly around this kind of topic. And my most recent book was called The Imaginary App. So I was going to do a presentation about apps and music. Oh, OK. All right, there we go. So apps and music. There we go. So the interesting thing about going on after a cognitive scientist or someone dealing with renewable energy, I just want to make sure about sound. All right, is I deal with the sound ecosystem. This is an iPad app that me and some friends developed, and we've had over 15 million downloads. Basically what it does is it pulls everything you have from iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, all the major music formats, and you have access to it while you're DJing. And so essentially, when you think about the role of music in our time, I like to call it sort of the post-playlist culture. So essentially, you have access to any song that's ever been recorded and encoded. So when you start thinking about the role of culture in the arts, we're now looking at this era of, for lack of a better word, the quantified self. When you think about your average person when they go to a museum, for example, will stare at a painting for less than 30 seconds. They've actually done a lot of metrics on that. I was artist in residence at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And so the idea was to come up with apps that relate to not just music and the arts, but how we think about pulling all these things into one space, the mobile media platform. So my most recent book with MIT, and by the way, this is on purpose. I'm doing this totally as what I call post-PowerPoint. I'm really sick of PowerPoint. So you're going to get a little tour through my hard drive here. So basically, the most recent book is called The Imaginary App. And I work with people like Stephen Wolfram from Wolfram Alpha and a whole bunch of other people looking at quantification of culture. And one of the things that came to mind when I was working on the book was people can't seem to get this idea that how much culture has been digitized has then reached back into the real world and changed our own specific taste and how we think about the idea of algorithmic search. So recently I went to Antarctica, and I wanted to challenge myself as an artist to do a series of compositions about the sound of environmental or climate change. And essentially what ended up happening was we had a series of projects that were inspired by this phrase, what I like to say from Pythagoras, all is number. Now, the ancient Greeks really got it, I think, on a lot of levels, and Pythagoras particularly, and him and Heraclitus particularly. Now, when you think about our modern tuning systems, Most of our tuning systems come from ancient Greece, and it was mainly based on their relationships to various mythic characters. For example, minor chord, major chord, they're usually related to what you call the Phrygian, Lydian sort of tone patterns and structures. But for them, it was mathematics and its relationship to the everyday. So for us in the 21st century, digital media has now taken on that same role. So there's another person I want to riff on, and that's Pandora. And I'm going to all tie this together in a second here. Now, Pandora's box, the box you see there, was one of the kind of major primary myths of the idea of too much information and knowledge. And when it's opened, of course, all these muses fly out. But one of the ones that stayed behind, and the last muse to leave the box, was this person, Elpis. Elpis was the muse of hope. And for me, as an artist, it's really interesting because the Greeks had a very different relationship to hope. For them, it was bad. It was like the light at the end of the tunnel that just keeps receding that you can never get to. And what ended up happening is that hope itself was always something that was viewed as slightly like a negative. But in our era, with climate change, mass extinction, radical degradation of the environment, and almost every other issue facing our society and technology, as we move further into the 21st century, the role of the arts is more important than ever. Not for this kind of hope, but for giving us a better portrait of the emotional context of how we catalyze or how we change society. So, for me at least, as an artist, that is the power of our time. So, like I said earlier, when I was in Antarctica, I basically carried a studio in a backpack, and you're going to hear some of the compositions I wrote in Antarctica tomorrow at the gala. And I'll be sampling and looping material live through my iPad app and sort of showing how to remix some data generated by the expedition. So basically, I was doing photography, thinking about this idea of the degraded landscape. For example, this ended up at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And what's surprising about this stunningly beautiful imagery is that it should be all ice, but it's actually water. It might look beautiful, but it's actually a portrait of devastation. These are huge icebergs that were about the size of a Volkswagen bus. And I was doing photography, taking acoustic portraits, and then generated a series of compositions. So this is some of the data generated on the expedition of the temperature fluctuations. And then I transformed that into what you call algorithmic musical transcription, and was able to take the weather patterns and actually use it to make compositions. So you'll be hearing that tomorrow. I don't want to give everything away, and I only have 5 minutes here. But basically, you're looking at this idea of going back to the ancient Greek thought process of all is number. As we quantify the world around us, the role of the artist or the composer is to use that as a new palette, some place that we can think of as a creative process that actually allows us to reach into the very heart of our society, which is what I think the arts do, and allow us to reimagine what is possible. The 20th century gave us the industrial process on one hand and artists like Andy Warhol or Jeff Koons on the other. The 21st century is now giving us this idea of data itself as the new palette. So I'm going to wrap up with that. And I know I'm going to play a short video, but I do want to just say, going to Antarctica as a half Jamaican here was one of the most cold experiences of my entire life. And this is what you're kind of seeing, geometry at work. This is what you call a hexagonal form. It's a fractal dimension of ice, and also the idea of patterns. You're seeing a sort of recursion of form. But also, we black people, we love ice. So we have people like Iceberg Slim, Ice Cube, Ice T. If you got the white guy, you got Vanilla Ice, So the whole pun here is you have the poetics versus the science. And I think that's where we have to really think about climate change and other ideas around using data itself to not just use it to create, okay, here's another data mining engine, here's another app, here's another startup, but to say this is art in its most pure and mathematic form. And that's where we go back to this gentleman that I was beginning my discussion with, Pythagoras, and we say all is number. So thank you very much.